All right, welcome back. This is lecture 11 on our very last lecture. We have a whole bunch of pre-frosh here with us today, so everyone should please be nice and smart. And the pre-frosh who are in the room, you guys should certainly feel free to ask questions if they arise, and also if you need to get to other pre-froshy things, you're welcome to depart whenever you need to. Today is about security. And this is a topic that applies mostly to things server-side, whether you're actually using iOS hardware or some other mobile device, or are doing purely web-based server-side development. And really the objective today is not necessarily to put forth answers to a whole bunch of non-obvious security questions, but really to start get you guys thinking about what should you be thinking about when you design software that other people are actually going to use, particularly when some of those people are malicious or simply do things that you don't intend. And indeed, certainly being Harvard undergrads with lots of techie friends, if and when you do work on your next project or your next startup, rest assured that at least one of your friends late at night is going to try to shame you by finding some fatal flaw in your tool that you've developed online. And we see this all the time in CS50, and it takes just days for people to start poking holes in various popular CS50 projects. So the goal ultimately is to get you to start thinking defensively. So a fun thing to start with is this here tool, which you may have played with a year or so ago, and some of you may have seen these screenshots in the past. But just to get you cognizant about some of the data that's accessible, for better or for worse these days, this tool was released just about a year ago when it became known that Apple's iTunes had not been encrypting geolocation data that it had been tracking. So this is disclosed if you read the 27-page terms of service document before you use an iPhone device or an iOS device. You will see in there that Apple reserves the right to track your location for a couple of reasons, and we'll come back to that. But what they were doing initially in iTunes is not encrypting that information with your Apple ID or anything like that. So the implication was if that anyone else had physical access to your laptop or your Mac desktop, whether it's friend, roommate, fiance, spouse, whatnot, that person could see everywhere you've been. And you can imagine some fun scenarios in which that's not necessarily a good thing. So I ran this on my own phone a while back. And I saw this picture arise. So this context, again, it's just a big XML file that iTunes stores on one's hard drive. And if you analyze the GPS coordinates in it, you can then plot it on a graph, on a map, which this here tool did. And you can see that around that time, or at least as long as I had that particular iPhone, spent a lot of time in the Northeast. I went to Texas, went to Pennsylvania, went to San Francisco, and thereabouts. But if you dive in deeper, you can see just how granular this data is. So this is zoomed in on the Boston area, and the very blue splotch is mostly over Boston and the Cambridge area, where I do spend a good amount of time. And then the dots elsewhere suggest little random trips I made to the suburbs and the like. But you can see other data if we zoom out a little bit. I did that year a lot of commuting back and forth to New York, and you can literally see me on Amtrak starting at top right, which is the big blue dot in Boston, going down there to New York, going down further to Stamford, Connecticut, and you can see the density of just either how long the Amtrak trains took or how many times I went back and forth on this route. And I also vacationed briefly on Cape Cod that year, which you can see there in the little hook of a map. So if we zoom out, this was kind of fun because I actually, when I looked at this data, had no recollection of actually being in Pennsylvania. And I was wondering why my phone had apparently been there in western Pennsylvania. And then I realized that I had, in fact, visited Carnegie Mellon that year. So that wasn't a huge surprise. And then you can look a little closer at some of the data in the West Coast and the like, and even see some of the flight paths that I took in making travels that year. So all kind of fun and interesting. And you might be able to use this tool still if you're able to decrypt the file that's still resident on your computer. But let's take a step back. Why does Apple need to know everywhere I have been in this fashion? And why is this all being logged in the first place? Yeah. Okay, so for ads, right, it's actually kind of a compelling story to be able to walk past Starbucks or something like that, and in theory, be able to get some push notification that says, hey, come into Starbucks now and we'll give you half price or something like that. So geolocation can actually be beneficial, certainly for the advertisers, and maybe for the consumer, if not too invasive.
Wi-Fi hotspot tags?
Wi-Fi hotspot tags, what do you mean by that?
Like adhere a location to certain Wi-Fi hotspots if your Wi-Fi has been turned on
Oh.
while you're traveling.
Okay. So be more concrete. What's the relationship between the GPS coordinates and Wi-Fi here?
So like if there's a Wi-Fi hotspot that doesn't already have a location associated with it,
Good.
you can associate the location with it.
Okay, exactly. So you might know that over the years, companies like Google have done a lot of war driving, which means driving around in a special car that actually listens for Wi-Fi hotspots so that you can actually plot out where various SSIDs are. By SSID on campus, I mean something like Harvard University, or if you're at home, maybe quote-unquote Linksys, or whatever the default names or customized names are for these access points. But Apple and Google and the like certainly don't know where my access point is. But if someone drives past my apartment, and that device has a GPS transponder in it, and therefore knows precisely what the latitude longitudinal coordinates are of the car or the person at that moment in time, and that person's phone also hears, in addition to talking to the GPS satellite, also hears my SSID from home, or Harvard University's SSID from home, now that person's phone, even if it's some random stranger on the street, can upload it to Apple and inform them, hey, next time you see quote-unquote Harvard University, it's at these GPS coordinates. So those of you who only have iPod Touches or devices that don't have GPS transponders, you can still use things like Google Maps and hit location, and it can find you with pretty decent accuracy, at least within a bunch of meters, and that's typically because the device is checking what access points can I hear. I hear Harvard University, I hear Starbucks, I hear the Coop, and you can do sort of triangulation style geolocation without using actual GPS. So that's kind of a win overall, and it requires that no one has to drive around constantly looking for this, because you now have millions of us people doing this for these companies.
On a similar note, Apple puts hotspots of their own all over the place.
Okay.
To get them to know where people are on computers so they can figure out what has those demand.
Demand in what sense?
Demand for internet hotspots, where they should
Okay.
be.
Okay, good. So you can use it to actually infer what kind of density you should have in terms of Wi-Fi hotspots. And as you all probably know, this building, for instance, has no wireless connectivity. As an aside, it's apparently for historical reasons. There's a historical society that doesn't want us sullying the walls with antennas and whatnot. Ironic given the other hardware that's in here, but that's why, but they're working on it. So that could, too, be another reason as well. So with the cool thing, at least from a developer's perspective, is that you actually then have access to really interesting data. And you have the ability to geolocate users, to figure out where they are. You can do creepy things like finding your friends on Android devices and iOS devices now, all because we're kind of walking around with these things in our pocket. So this is only to say, now that you have all this more information available to you, for better or for worse, the onus becomes on you to actually keep this information, whether developer or person, safe or safer, and recognize what could be divulged. So more generally then, what are some obvious threats to security? So here's a list, some of whose protocols you might know, some of which you might not. In what sense do HTTP and MySQL, two of the more familiar, pose threats to security of person or application, would you say? What are the scenarios you have to worry about if you just know that some website or some app is using these tools? Yeah?
Cross-site scripting.
Okay, cross-site scripting, what's that?
It's injecting pieces of JavaScript, for example, in user input to a website.
Okay.
And then get executed when it gets displayed on the page.
Okay, good. So cross-site scripting refers to this somehow kind of injection of JavaScript code into some website such that the user is tricked into executing it. And we'll see some examples actually today of that. So that relates, of course, to, I guess, to HTTP, but even higher level. That relates really to HTML and JavaScript and the like. Yeah? Good.
Or they could put some SQL code in there, query your database, either get information out or do horrible things to it.
Perfect. So there's SQL injection attacks, which we'll see also some example of, but in a nutshell, this refers to the ability of an adversary or even just some user to accidentally execute SQL queries on your database because you, the developer, have not actually scrubbed user inputs, which simply means making sure that there aren't dangerous characters like quotes and semicolons and things that could be mistaken for actual database queries. Yeah?
Also, the fact that MySQL is so centralized, allowing so somebody's able to hack into one password, they can get all the information instantaneously.
Yeah, so the centralization of most databases, MySQL among them, is actually kind of a serious thing. There's certainly convenience of having your user's database and their email addresses and their credit card numbers and passwords or hashes thereof, plus address information, purchasing history. I mean, it makes sense, and especially when we talk about database design, to have all of this data in the same database, maybe separate tables for design's sake, but in the same place. But that just means if one person gets into this database, then potentially all of your data might be compromised. And so one of the things we didn't talk about about this semester, but things you can do with tools like MySQL is you can absolutely create separate user accounts, usernames and passwords that have different privileges. In fact, if you go back and poke around with phpMyAdmin and you log in as root on the appliance, for instance, with password Crimson, there's a privileges tab, and you can see there that you can create any number of usernames. And so quite common, especially if you want to be adhering to best security practices, you would have usernames for MySQL that, for instance, can only do selects, and another username that can only do inserts. So at least you're refining the scope of someone's capabilities so that if one of those accounts is compromised, at least you don't lose everything.